with some business leaders at the White House that happened just moments ago. I want to bring in David Goodfriend. He's a former deputy staff secretary in the Clinton White House. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. David, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So we just heard President Trump describe his Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch there. He said he's one of, great education, and he asked for a dignified process. Obviously, Democrats are going to put up a very tough fight during his confirmation hearing. The president then saying, when he was asked about the nuclear option that exists with Senator Mitch McConnell, he said, if he can, I would say to Mitch, go nuclear. Right. The founding fathers put in the filibuster for the Senate because they wanted a more measured debate as opposed to the debates that perhaps were much more heated in the House of Representatives. And now this idea of doing away with the filibuster specifically for Supreme Court nominees. What do you make of that?
Well, I certainly think that we're at a time where minority rights of all kinds are really under siege. Minority rights in the constitutional context really means that even where a majority of, let's say, House members or a majority of senators want something, there should be something in place to protect the minority, because otherwise we have what the founders called a tyranny of the majority. And that was the basis behind that 60-vote supermajority margin that would be required to bring debate to a close in the Senate. Now, I have to say it was Democratic leader Harry Reid who changed that rule for confirmations below the Supreme Court, and that's how a lot of the vacancies on the D.C. Circuit, for example, were filled towards the end of the Obama administration. It would not be unheard of, I think, for Mitch McConnell then to return fire by saying, fine, we'll get rid of the last remaining confirmation supermajority threshold, the Supreme Court. The problem I think that the Republicans have is that there are Republican senators up for re-election in states that Hillary Clinton carried that might have some problems with going nuclear. And I'll name one of them. Cory Gardner is a Republican from Colorado. He heads up the Republican senators' campaign committee. He's going to have some explaining to do in Colorado when he's up for re-election in the midterm, with a lot of people in Colorado very upset about Donald Trump. Now, the Supreme Court nominee, I think, is certainly qualified from a credential standpoint. He clerked on the Supreme Court. He's got the intellectual rigor. But we can't look at this in a vacuum. The Republicans basically stonewalled Barack Obama's nominee for this seat, Merrick Garland, an equally as qualified jurist from the D.C. Circuit. They stonewalled it. They would not even have a hearing. And President Obama warned us. He said the biggest problem we have with this is that when the worm turns and it's the Democrats' turn, they're going to feel compelled to do exactly the same thing. I think President Obama's words are prescient here. He's shown us time and again his wisdom, and I think in this case he's said, stonewalling my nominee doesn't mean you get a free pass when yours comes up, and that's the dynamic we have, unfortunately.
I guess, David, the question a lot of people have is, look, is this the Democrats' fault? Because, as you pointed out, Harry Reid got rid of that filibuster for some of these other lower-level nominations. And now the Republicans are saying, as you pointed out, look, we're going to do the exact same thing. Although I should point out that Rebecca Berg, who's a reporter at Real Clear Politics, is saying that Senator Blumenthal said that the Democrats should not obstruct the Gorsuch confirmation, saying, quote, we should not repeat the Republican wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right.
Yeah, I happen to know and really like and respect Senator Blumenthal, and his chief of staff just put out a correction. I want to make sure we're clear about this. Senator Blumenthal is still willing to filibuster on the final vote. What he's saying is we should at least allow the process to go forward, and I think that's a very important distinction to make. He's not saying let's just throw down and walk away from it. He's saying, okay, let's have the hearings, let's hear what you have to say, but he reserves the right to vote against moving to a final vote, that supermajority 60-vote requirement. Now, I think in this case, it's really important to be, if we're going to assign blame here, I mean, I'm a partisan, I'm a Democrat. I would start with what happened when Barack Obama was elected and all of the Republicans in the Senate refused to cooperate on anything. I mean, you can't really find too many bills where even a few Republicans peeled off and voted with Democrats, and that certainly was true with respect to confirmations. The decision by then Majority Leader Harry Reid to allow a simple majority vote on confirmations was because we had a crisis on our hands. The judiciary was understaffed. There weren't enough judges for the caseload. And this was Harry Reid's way of saying, all right, well, we got to populate the courts with functioning judges. Let's do it this way. That was what got us here. I wouldn't start with the Harry Reid reaction as what got us to this dynamic. It was the intransigence of Senate Republicans for 8 years that I would start with. Now here we are. Now we've got a super polarized Senate where all sorts of traditional comity with a T has been thrown out the window. It's really not a good scene. And if you're ready to, I'd like to talk about some of the other nominees that are being put through this process.
I would like to talk about that. I just want to get one last question in about this particular debate. We've seen this fiery debate in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I wonder if Americans aren't getting tired of this gridlock. In other words, politicians just simply voting along party lines. I mean, I'm reminded again of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where you saw 27 Republicans joining 44 Democrats to stop a filibuster by Southerners, and they ultimately got that landmark legislation passed. I mean, are we completely beyond anything like that ever again?
I'm hopeful still that there are some things where we'll see coalescing by Democrats and Republicans. Let me give you one example, okay? Candidate Trump talked a lot about doing a big infrastructure program. We haven't heard too much of that from President Trump, but at least as a candidate, he said, let's rebuild roads, bridges, airports, ports, broadband. And you got a lot of Democrats, especially from upper Midwestern states like Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin or Sherrod Brown from Ohio, saying, we will join you in that. We would actually like to work on that with you. I'm hopeful that we can still find ways where Democrats and Republicans can coalesce around that. Tax reform may be another one. But right now, the way that the president has rolled out the sequencing of his early days, he's gone for very volatile, very partisan issues that seem to drive a wedge rather than bring together members of Congress. I would like to see him bring up quickly, or Majority Leader McConnell or Speaker Ryan, bring up that broadband and infrastructure bill, bring up a bill that would be something that the parties could work on together. We sorely need it. The problem, I think, is that all of these decisions, whether it's the ban on certain immigrants and refugees from the country that really instigated a very passionate battle, or, for that matter, a Supreme Court justice whose views are completely out of the mainstream and, of course, are going to engender the ire of a lot of Democrats. This isn't the way you start an administration, by bringing people together. This is seemingly a purposeful effort to drive a wedge, and I think that's leading to a lot of the partisanship you see.
So let's talk about some of the other picks. What's your take on how we move forward?
Well, let me talk about two. Okay, there's Dr. Price, who's the nominee for Health and Human Services, and then there's Steve Mnuchin, the nominee for Secretary of Treasury. Something really unusual has happened here that I think merits our focus. Both of those nominees were grilled in long hearings, and then new facts seemed to come up. In the case of Steve Mnuchin, it was $100 million that he was not aware of that raised a tax compliance question. In the case of Dr. Price, it was investments that he made in stocks after having introduced a bill expressly designed to help those companies, and it's an insider trading question. Democrats felt that there was new information that needed to be vetted in a hearing. When that wasn't going to happen, the Democrats refused to show up for the vote. They boycotted the vote, which meant the Republican majority did not have a quorum. Now, usually that would mean we got to come to the table and strike a deal so we can get our quorum, so we can have the vote. Do you want more time for a hearing? Okay, let's make a compromise. Back when I worked in the Senate in the 90s, that's how those things usually played out. Not this time. Now what we have is the Republican majority saying, fine, we're just going to bypass the committee process altogether and bring this to a full vote. There you see on your screen, that's Senator Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Finance Committee, and he's the one who had to conduct these hearings or have the confirmation vote. Now, it's my understanding from Senate rules, and I've talked to some very senior Senate veterans about this. It's my understanding that when you bypass that committee, you got to have unanimous consent. That means all 100 senators agree, okay, we'll let this go straight to the floor. Or you have to at least have someone introduce the motion that has to come to a vote to bypass the committee and bring it to the floor. None of that, to the best of my knowledge, none of that happened here. Now, I go back to what I said about a tyranny of the majority and minority rights. If this is true, if Senate rules themselves designed to have a smooth process for going past the committees and bringing something to the Senate floor, if all that was bypassed and violated Senate rules, Now we have a crisis on our hand. I mean, we have a real crisis on our hands because minority rights are being trampled, and that's exactly what the Constitution and exactly what Senate rules were designed to avoid. I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope somebody can email CBS Interactive and explain why I'm wrong. But I've spoken to a senior former staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I've spoken to parliamentarian experts, and I myself can't remember a time where this happened without the proper process and vote that would give minority senators a chance to weigh in. That is dangerous.
So, David, I've been talking about this article in the Washington Post on the death of the Senate and its long history as the world's greatest deliberative body. I don't know if you've read it, but is this what you're suggesting, that because of the majority rule right now, we may see some of these checks and balances that the founders and the framers put into the Constitution when it comes to the Senate done away with?
Well, let me be clear. I'm going to put on my law professor hat and bore you a little bit. The Senate rules aren't really codified in the Constitution. So let's get that straight. This is Senate rules and basically centuries of tradition that are at stake. The concept from the constitutional founders is one of protecting minority rights and having a bicameral system, both a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate based on 2 senators per state, no matter what the population. That was all designed to, in effect, protect minority rights. And I would even argue that the Republican senators from smaller states that don't represent a huge proportion of the population are exercising disproportionate power precisely under that theory. That's okay. That's our system. But when you then trample on Senate rules so that you can trample the minority views in the Senate, then the whole concept of protecting minority rights in a democracy seems to be under threat, to me. And I think that's dangerous. Look, if the Republicans have the guts to put that information about their nominees out there and then have a vote, that's confident. That's saying, hey, we think these guys have got the goods. We'll put the information out there and then have the vote. That would take guts, and that would show that they have the backbone to stick up for their own nominees. What seems to be happening, in my view, is that they don't have the goods. They know that there's vulnerabilities, and rather than bring that out into sunlight, they're going to trample the Senate rules in order to get what they want. Very dangerous.
David, that was not a boring, I don't want to call it a lecture, but it was really interesting, and it's certainly interesting for those of us who are not well-versed in the Constitution, at least from a legal standpoint. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. David Goodfriend, former Deputy Staff Secretary in the Clinton White House. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.